Professor Feng Lei, also known as Ray Wang, is one of the most interesting figures in China's emerging artificial intelligence and data infrastructure ecosystem. As the founder, chairman, and CEO of OpenPie, he has developed a project centered on data computing, private AI, trusted data spaces, and the integration between enterprise data and large AI models. His career has moved through some of the key technological transformations of the last 2 decades, from cloud computing and database system to today's debate on artificial intelligence, data sovereignty, and agentic AI. Professor Ray, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
In recent years, artificial intelligence has increasingly moved beyond the sphere of language models and consumer applications. The real strategic question today concerns the infrastructure that connects data, models, decision-making systems, and real-world operations. In the West, Palantir has become one of the most visible symbols of this shift, a company that presents itself as an operating system for institutions, enterprises, and governments, but also one deeply associated with defense, intelligence, security, and geopolitical power. OpenPie, on the other hand, appears to operate in a similar strategic space, but with a very different vocabulary and perhaps a different philosophy. Your work emphasizes data computing, private AI, trusted data spaces, the integration between data and models, and the question of data sovereignty. This raises an important issue, whether OpenPie should be understood simply as a Chinese counterpart to Palantir, or whether it represents a genuinely alternative paradigm for the age of artificial intelligence.
In my view, we have a very different philosophy from Palantir. Of course, some of the technologies and the visions are shared, but underneath the philosophy is very different. From technical point of view, we realize that large language models has already read all the public available data. So all the enterprises and the large enterprise and the small and medium-sized business, they all realize now their data is their unique asset. So instead of sending the data to the public cloud, which they have the risk of being trained, so they would rather just have the large language model to be installed on premise. Then we have invented this technology to allow them to, autonomously combine their private data and the open source large language models, so that they can build their own agentic AI that suits their own business needs. Now, with this technology, OpenPie relies on heavily open source large language models, so that we have make this technology available not only to the governments, Fortune 500, we make it available to the small and medium-sized business as well, and as well as those new companies called one-person companies, small companies. So in OpenPie's view, we want to democratize this technology, and we want to make sure that your data, you have your own sovereignty for that. So we generally want to make AI for everybody.
Do you see OpenPie as part of a broader effort to build technological autonomy in China, especially in a global environment still dominated by US cloud, software, and AI platforms?
I want to share a little bit of my previous venture in the US. So I worked with, the former head of the Windows operating system. We created a company called Pivotal. We worked on the cloud native data platform. So the whole idea that we want to, accumulate a lot of data, but mainly on the public cloud. In China has a very different view. China, basically, they don't like the idea of uploading data to the cloud. So the business environment in China and actually the use cases are quite different from the US. So I see actually OpenPie is, starting from the Chinese business setting the user requirements. We believe the user requirements is also shared by some other, regions like Europe. I saw Europe has very strict regulations around the use of data. Even personal data, don't mention the business data. So I feel like even in the US, I think in the long run, the data sovereignty is a concern for business. So we come to China, basically, we see, China's, business requirements are a little bit different. Maybe the requirements represent the future of all business. So I think it's a better idea for me to start in China. But the view is that we want to be a global company. So we never say we just, customize the technology for China. We see China's requirements, maybe it's a little bit representative of the future. So that's why we want to start with the future requirements, not now for you to do a startup.
The expression data sovereignty is widely used today, but often in a vague way. What does data sovereignty mean in concrete terms for you?
Yeah, so I think data is that your data is owned by you, not by somebody else. This sounds like very simple. Let me give you an example that your data is not owned by you. In the mobile platform today, I just came here with a Didi. So did Didi own the data? Of course, they do. Will they use the data for their own purpose? Probably, yes. Probably no, but I don't know. But I have this concern, right? So in the future, I see that this record should be stored in a sandbox of mine. Even if it's in the cloud, it's still encrypted sandbox of mine that and somebody else want to train the data, train the model using the data, they should send me a request, ask for approvals, or they should pay for the use the request. Even I approve this, they should pay for that, right? That's the whole idea called trusted data space or international data space, which they have headquartered in Germany. So we have similar views that your data is owned by you, authorized by you, and if somebody wants to use it, and you have the right to get the pay for that, right? So that's the whole idea of data sovereignty. And today, large language models pretty much reads everything. And if for small business or personal use like us, if we don't have our data, we don't have anything to say in the future of the generative AI, the agentic AI. Basically, that's not the future that we would like to have, right? So it's a very different future. So with the data sovereignty, we have something to say in the future, in the agentic AI era, right?
Many governments and enterprises fear that the use of foreign cloud platforms or foreign AI systems may expose sensitive data to external political, legal, or intelligence pressure. How does OpenPie address this concern?
So every country has different regulations on the use of the data. But for the technology side, itself, it's installed on premise. It's like you all installed your Oracle database managing your data. That problem has been addressed many decades ago, right? Our company installed Oracle database in Europe, in Japan, in China. So as long as the technology is compliant with the regulations, then basically you still own your data. The technology is just past all the compliance regulations. So this is something not new. So OpenPie will make sure that our technology will be compliant to all the requirements. Okay, in China, in Europe. In China, we submitted the request for compliance clearance. Then also we plan if we go to Europe, we will work with the Europe regulations to make sure that they'll be compliant with the regulations. But this is not a harder problem than the data sovereignty problem. So this problem is relatively mature, easier. Basically, it's technology regulations. Of course, we can submit all the source code if it's needed, right? But we didn't say we will open source for other technologies, but we will submit the source code to our big enterprises if they would like to.
So let's talk about Europe. For a country in Europe, choosing an AI infrastructure provider can also mean entering into a relationship of technological dependence, usually with the United States. How can OpenPie convince international partners that it offers sovereignty rather than a new form of dependency?
Yeah, exactly. So as I said, OpenPie has much better altitude. We can submit the source code to the regulations, to the enterprises with the NDA if they would love to. But as I said earlier, the philosophy is very different. OpenPie wants to democratize this technology, and OpenPie is created to solve the data sovereignty issue. So basically, for example, we will be installing lots of open source large language models for enterprises. And also, because, we want to democratize, we would like to share the success with the customers. So I think the license side, I think it's much more affordable too, right? And last but not least, I think it's always better to have an alternative, if you want to secure suppliers, right? early days, I worked for, the mobile systems, all the larger mobile phone, providers like Samsung. They all have different, platforms like Philip, and also they have a little bit of, Nokia. So they have different platforms. Want to make sure that they are secure in terms of suppliers.
The United States has long dominated the global digital infrastructure through cloud platforms, operating systems, enterprise software, and now AI services. Do you believe the age of artificial intelligence will intensify the imbalance, or can it open the door to a more multipolar technological order?
I would believe that we open the door for more people to play in the playground. And even the US, I think there's more companies now provide technology and services similar to Palantir. And, China definitely opens a very different alternative. For example, in the cloud era, US have AWS, Google, China has Alibaba Cloud, Tencent Cloud, right? If you look at the large language models, the US has, others like Gemini. And in terms of open source, actually, the US doesn't have many. Interestingly, they don't have many open source models. Initially, they have Llama from Meta, but now it seems that they're not supporting this large language model for open sourcing. But China do have more open source large language models like, DeepSeek, and we also have, new open source model like Kimi. So I think China has a very interesting, view. Now China has become more open source than in the US. And of course, I think OpenPie, we call it OpenPie. We didn't call us closed pie. We are very open. So we make sure we have a very open attitude. We are here with a very humble attitude. We have an alternative. We are much more willing to, tailor to your need. We want to make sure address your data, sovereignty concerns. So we are here to basically offer you an alternative, with a much humble attitude.
So, talking a bit more in practical terms, how does OpenPie allow an enterprise to use AI while keeping control over its own data?
Basically, the core of the platform is still a cloud-native core. So basically, all the computing is separated from the data storage. So you store your data, and all the data is encrypted. So you don't have any, concerns of leaking the data while it's being computed. Okay, all the computation is happening in the memory, and also a little bit called, something technology called encryption, but it's different from encryption. It has a little bit of hashing of the memory address that makes sure that all the data is in memory, even if it's copied, then they cannot understand the data. So then once the computation is over, you just take away the result. All the data is still stored where it is. That's the core of the invention of the company. We patented this technology.
So you have already said that OpenPie doesn't want to stay limited to China, but it wants to open to international partners. What are the most important sectors for OpenPie in the next 5 years?
So we started from China. So China is, one of the key competency, key competent industry is manufacturing. China is, very key player in the manufacturing. So actually, OpenPie had started in China to solve the needs of those manufacturing SMBs. So of course, when we go across globe, we want to still to help the manufacturing business, for example, in Southeast Asia. And traditionally, we also, I personally have a relationship with lots of the financial companies, and we would love to work with the financial sectors. For example, Hong Kong has a lot of banks there. It's not Chinese banks, it's international banks. And the Hong Kong financial market has become probably the second hottest market in the planet after the New York Stock Exchange. So we would love to be there to solve the financial needs, for agentic AI. And the financial sector, normally they have very strict regulations on data privacy, data sovereignties. I think the open technology is very suited there.
What kind of partners are you looking for internationally, like governments, universities, industrial groups, cloud providers, research institutions, or local technology companies?
I would have started with universities, for academia kind of exchange first, because OpenPie is still a startup. We haven't, have a lot of subsidies created outside China. So we would like to collaborate with the universities, and I'm working with this called a Belt and Road, local cooperation, local collaboration, BRLC, that make sure that that's why we are connected through the BRLC. So we want to make sure that all the BRLC, cities, they have university to collaborate with us. Then OpenPie will have the boot camp program that train the professors or the researchers to use the platform, and they can access the source code if they would love to. Then they take the methodologies and the technologies back home, help us to expand there. That's the initial plan. Of course, if they want to work with local manufacturing, local financial partners, we can share our case studies, the successful stories with them to make sure they can be ramped up very quickly. And then in the long run, definitely OpenPie will be creating offices outside China, but this is something still ongoing.
And specifically about Europe, do you already have any partners in Europe? And do you think Europe can learn anything from your experience with OpenPie and in general from China?
I think Europe definitely is exchanging with China. For example, I think the BRLC has a program that has European, not just Europe, but also Middle East countries to visit China and use the Alibaba's e-commerce AI platform. Now it's different. It's AI, agentic AI. And we want to be part of that. We will offer more technologies and educational services there. And of course, in the long run, building subsidies programs there that so that all those visitors, students, professors from the BRLC countries can have access to the platform. Then they always, of course, they immediately access all the open technology, educational services, technologies, and the partner programs to build the offices in their home country.
Professor Ray, this conversation shows that the future of artificial intelligence cannot be reduced to the race for larger models or faster algorithms. The decisive question is who controls the data, where the data is processed, which infrastructure connects it to AI systems, and under what political, legal, and ethical conditions these systems operate. I would like to close with one final question. In your view, what must be done to ensure that AI serves human development and institutional autonomy rather than becoming a new architecture of control?
Yes, so there's two futures ahead of us. One is that the AI benefits everybody. We live in a very, affluent society, so that everybody can pursue their own interest. Then that'll be a very good future. And the other future is that small handful groups that basically owns everything: the platforms, the data, the technology. Then we will be under the charity of AI. So that's the future that we are not imagining. And I think we want to make sure we are very, very careful because now AI is self-improving. Right now we are at the diverging point. So OpenPie want to make sure that most of our work is for everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.